Before we begin tonight's journey, I want to welcome you here. If you find peace in these words, if this story helps you drift into rest, please consider subscribing and leaving a like. It helps others find their way to these gentle tales. Now, settle into your pillow, close your eyes, and let me take you back to a spring night in 1453, to a city between two worlds, where history moved as quietly as your breath about to slow. The night settled over the city like a blanket woven from centuries of memory. Constantinople stood as it had for more than 1,000 years, its massive walls rising from the earth like the bones of some ancient giant, worn smooth by wind and time and the countless hands that had touched them in passing. The stones remembered everything, every season, every siege, every morning when the sun rose over the Golden Horn and painted the domes with light that seemed to come from another world entirely. But tonight, the stones were quiet, holding their memories close, and the city breathed in the darkness with a rhythm that had grown slower, heavier, like a heart that knows it has counted almost all speeds. The walls themselves told a story that stretched back through time. They had been built by Theodosius, emperor of an age when Rome still dreamed of eternity, raised stone by stone with the labor of thousands, each block placed with the certainty that they would stand forever. And they had stood, through earthquake and assault, through the centuries when the world beyond them changed and changed again while Constantinople remained, a jewel of marble and gold, a bridge between the ancient world and whatever would come after. 3 layers of walls encircled the landward side, each one taller than the last, with towers that reached toward heaven as if to touch the very hand of God. The outer wall stood lower, meant to slow any advance, and behind it the main wall rose 40 feet into the air, thick enough that chariots could race along its top, and behind that, the inner wall, the final guardian, massive and ancient and cracked now in places where time and cannon fire had begun to pull it apart. The sea walls were different, lower, and less formidable, because for centuries the waters themselves had been protection enough. The Golden Horn, that curved inlet of the Bosporus, was sealed with a great chain, iron links as thick as a man's leg, stretched across the water to keep enemy ships from entering. It had always been enough. The city had always been safe on its peninsula, surrounded by water on 3 sides, approachable only from the west where those tremendous walls stood guard. But now, in the spring of 1453, the chain was still there, the wall still stood, and yet something had changed. The world had learned new ways to break old things. The siege had begun weeks before, on the 6th day of April, when the army of Sultan Mehmed II had arrived like a flood across the hills of Thrace. They came in numbers that seemed impossible to count, tens of thousands of men, perhaps more, Ottoman soldiers who set up their tents in neat rows that stretched beyond the horizon, a city of canvas and smoke that surrounded Constantinople on the landward side like a second set of walls, these ones living and breathing and waiting. Mehmed himself was young, only 21 years old, but he carried himself with a certainty that made older men uneasy. He had dreamed of taking Constantinople since he was a boy, and he had spent years preparing, gathering the best engineers, the finest cannon makers, anyone who could help him accomplish what so many before him had failed to do. And he had brought with him something that had never been seen before in war, a weapon that belonged more to nightmare than to the waking world. It was a cannon, but to call it merely that was like calling the ocean merely water. It had been cast by a Hungarian engineer named Urban, a man who understood the language of metal and fire, and it was a monster of bronze, more than 27 feet long, with a bore wide enough that a man could crawl inside. It fired stone balls that weighed over half a ton, and when it spoke, the sound was not like thunder but like the earth itself splitting open. The cannon required hundreds of oxen to move it, and a crew of hundreds more to operate it. and it could only be fired 7 times a day because the heat would crack the metal if pushed harder. But 7 times a day was enough. Each ball that flew from its mouth traveled through the air with a scream that could be heard for miles, and when it struck the walls of Constantinople, the stones that had stood for 1,000 years shuddered and crumbled and fell. There were other cannons too, smaller but still terrible, placed along the line of Ottoman forces, and they fired constantly through the days and into the nights, a rhythm of destruction that never quite stopped. The defenders would rush to repair the walls after each bombardment, working through the night to fill the breaches with whatever they could find, rubble and timber and earth, anything to keep the gaps closed. But each morning the cannons would speak again and the work would be undone. It was like trying to heal a wound that would not stop bleeding. Inside the city, the people went about their lives with a strange kind of calm. They had been through sieges before. The walls had always held. But this time there was something different in the air, a weight that pressed down on everyone, even those who tried to ignore it. The population had dwindled over the years as trade routes shifted and the empire shrank, and now perhaps 50,000 souls remained within the walls, maybe less. Many neighborhoods stood empty, houses abandoned, gardens gone wild, the city like a coat that had once fit perfectly but now hung loose on thinning shoulders. The emperor was Constantine XI, the last in a line that stretched back through the centuries, a man who knew the crown he wore was heavier than gold. He was in his 40s, neither young nor old, and he moved through the city each day visiting the walls, speaking with his soldiers, trying to keep hope alive in faces that grew more tired with each sunrise. He had fewer than 7,000 men to defend the walls, and of those, only 2,000 were professional soldiers. The rest were citizens who had taken up arms, merchants and craftsmen and clergymen, anyone who could hold a sword or draw a bow. There were also foreign fighters, Genoese and Venetian soldiers who had stayed to help defend the city, led by men like Giovanni Giustiniani, a Genoese commander whose presence was worth 1,000 men for the courage it gave others. Against them stood an army that seemed to have no end. Mehmed had not only his regular forces but also the Janissaries, the elite corps of the Ottoman army, men who had been taken as boys from Christian lands and raised to be soldiers, trained from childhood to fight with a discipline and ferocity that made them legendary. They were the Sultan's personal guard, and they would be the tip of the spear when the final assault came. But for now, in these weeks of April and into May, there was a rhythm to the siege that was almost like a terrible kind of routine. The cannons would fire, the walls would crack, the defenders would repair them. Ottoman soldiers would launch assaults, trying to scale the walls or force their way through damaged sections, and the defenders would drive them back with arrows and stones and boiling oil poured from above. Ships tried to force the chain across the Golden Horn, and failed. A relief fleet from Genoa managed to break through the Ottoman blockade and bring supplies and a few hundred more soldiers, a moment of wild celebration that faded quickly back into the grinding reality of the siege. Mehmed tried something that seemed impossible. His engineers built a road of greased logs over the hills behind the Genoese colony of Galata, and in a single night, they pulled 70 Ottoman ships overland, around a chain, and launched them into the Golden Horn behind the city's defenses. When the sun rose and the people of Constantinople saw enemy ships in their harbor, it must have felt like watching the laws of nature break. Now the sea walls were threatened too, and Constantine had to pull soldiers from the land walls to defend the harbor, stretching his thin forces even thinner. The cannons kept firing. The great cannon cracked and was repaired and fired again. The walls, those ancient walls, began to show wounds that could not be healed. The defenders fought with everything they had, but exhaustion was an enemy that could not be fought with swords. Men slept in their armor on the ramparts, too tired to walk back to their homes, knowing they might be needed at any moment. Women and children help carry stones and prepare food. Everyone in the city part of the defense now. Everyone knowing that if the walls fell, there would be no mercy. And through it all, the nights came, one after another, each one quieter than the fighting of the day but never quite silent. There were always sounds, distant voices, the clatter of armor, the creak of siege equipment being moved into position, and underneath it all, the whisper of the sea against the walls, the only thing that had not changed. On this particular night, the night our story holds close, the city rested in a stillness that felt different from the nights before. It was late May, the 28th day of the month, and the air had turned warm with the promise of summer that would not come, not for this city, not in the way it once had. The walls stood as they had stood, but they were wounded now, scarred and patched and crumbling in places, held together more by will than by stone. The great wound in the wall near the gate of St. Romanus had been filled with earth and barrels and timber, a makeshift barrier that everyone knew would not hold against a determined assault, but it was all they had. The meager garrison was stretched thin along miles of fortification. Emperor Constantine had positioned himself at the weakest point, the patched breach near the middle section of the land walls, where Giustiniani commanded the defense with his Genoese soldiers. If the Ottomans concentrated their attack there, as everyone expected they would, that was where the fate of the city would be decided. Further along the walls, other commanders held their sections with whatever men they had, clusters of defenders separated by long stretches where the walls were guarded by almost no one, because there were simply not enough soldiers to be everywhere at once. The people of the city had gathered in the great church of Hagia Sophia that evening for prayer. Catholics and Orthodox Christians, who had spent years arguing about theology and authority, stood together now under that vast dome, their voices rising in hymns that had been sung in that sacred space for 900 years. The emperor himself had been there, and when the service ended, he went to each of his commanders, speaking quiet words, thanking them, releasing them from their oaths of loyalty so that any who wished could flee before the end came. None left. They returned to their positions on the walls, and the city grew quiet. In the Ottoman camp, Murat prepared for what he knew would be the final assault. He had given his men a day of rest, letting them recover their strength, and as darkness fell on the 28th, he gave orders that the attack would begin before dawn. Every soldier was roused, every unit moved into position, and Mehmed made a promise that echoed through the camp like the cannon fire had echoed through the days before. When the city fell, his soldiers would have 3 days to plunder as they wished. Everything in Constantinople would be theirs, the gold, the treasures, the people themselves. It was the tradition of war, the reward for those who risked death in the assault, and it spread through the army like fire, anticipation and greed and hunger for the wealth that lay beyond those walls. But the night itself, the hours between midnight and dawn, belonged to neither army. It was a space held in suspension, the world taking a breath before everything changed. The Ottoman soldiers checked their weapons and said their prayers, and in the camps, fires burned low, casting shadows that danced like ghosts. The defenders on the walls looked out at those thousands of fires spread across the hills and knew that morning would bring the storm, the final test that would either save the city or end it forever. The air was cool but not cold, carrying the smell of the sea and the smoke from cooking fires and something else, something harder to name, the scent of tension and fear and resignation all mixed together. The moon was in its last quarter, giving just enough light to see shapes and shadows but leaving the world wrapped in a gray darkness that softened every edge. The walls themselves seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it, as if they were tired of being seen, tired of standing, ready to rest. Along the ramparts, the soldiers stood or sat or leaned against the ancient stones, and they did not speak much because there was nothing left to say. They were beyond speeches now, beyond brave words and promises. They had fought for weeks, and they would fight again when the sun rose, and that was all there was. Some of them were very young, boys really, who had taken up arms because everyone had, because there was no one else. Some were older, men who remembered when the city had been more than this, when the markets had been full and the harbor crowded with ships from every corner of the world. And some were foreigners, men from Venice and Genoa and other Italian cities, who had no obligation to be here except the one they chose, to stand with the city in its darkest hour because some things mattered more than safety. Emperor Constantine moved among them as he had every night, speaking quietly, a hand on a shoulder here, a few words there, and his presence was a comfort even though everyone knew that even emperors cannot change fate. He wore armor like any soldier, and he carried a sword, and when the assault came, he would fight on the walls with the rest of them, because there was no other place for him to be. The crown was just metal, but this, standing with these men, was what it meant to be a king. Giovanni Giustiniani stood near the bridge, looking out at the darkness where he knew the Ottoman lines waited. He was a condottiero, a professional soldier, a man who had fought in many wars and survived them all through skill and luck and a kind of calm courage that kept others steady when everything fell apart. He had fortified the breach as best he could, and his men trusted him, but even he could feel the weight of what was coming. The odds had never been good, and now they were worse than that. But he would stand, and his men would stand with him, and when the history of this night was written, no one would say they ran. The hours passed slowly, the way they do when waiting for something inevitable. There was no sudden event, no signal that the night was different from any other, just the slow turning of time, the moon moving across the sky, the stars wheeling overhead in their eternal patterns that cared nothing for the struggles of men below. In the houses behind the walls, people tried to sleep, families huddled together, children pressed against their parents, everyone taking what comfort they could from closeness and warmth and the pretense that tomorrow would be like any other day. In the churches, candles burned through the night, tended by priests who pray without ceasing, asking for miracles that might not come, asking for mercy in whatever form it might take. The icons looked down with their golden faces and eternal eyes, and perhaps they saw what was coming, or perhaps they saw only what they had always seen, the endless cycle of human struggle and hope and loss that plays out beneath the eyes of heaven. The sea breathed against the walls with gentle waves, the water dark and deep, and if you stood very still and listened, you could hear it, that ancient rhythm that had been there long before the city was built and would be there long after everything else had passed into memory. The waves did not care about sieges or empires. They simply came and went, a heartbeat older than human time. Somewhere in the darkness, a dog barked, the sound carrying through the empty streets, and then fell silent. A baby cried in one of the houses, and a mother's voice soothed it back to sleep. These small sounds, these ordinary moments, continued because life continued even when history was about to turn, even when the world was about to break and remake itself into something new. On the Ottoman side, in the command tent, Mehmed could not sleep. He stood looking at maps, at plans that had been drawn and redrawn, checking every detail one more time even though there was nothing left to check. He was so close now to the thing he had dreamed of since childhood, the conquest that would make him not just a sultan but a legend, the man who took Constantinople when all others had failed. But he also knew that battles could turn on small chances, that victory was never certain until it was over, and so he ran through the plan again in his mind, the sequence of assaults, the waves of soldiers, the places where pressure would be applied until something broke. He had ordered that the night attack would begin 2 hours before dawn, in the darkest hour when the defenders would be most tired, most likely to make mistakes. The first wave would be the irregulars, the Bashi bazooks, expendable troops whose job was to exhaust the defenders, to make them use their arrows and their strength so that when the real assault came, they would have less to fight with. After them would come the Anatolian soldiers, professional troops who would push hard at every weak point. And finally, if needed, the Janissaries, the best of the best, who would break whatever still stood. It was not a subtle plan, but it did not need to be. The walls were broken, the defenders were few, and weight of numbers would do what subtlety could not. In the darkness before dawn, before even the first gray light touched the eastern horizon, the Ottoman drums began to beat. It was a sound like distant thunder, rhythmic and relentless, and it grew louder as more drums joined, spreading through the camps until the entire army was pulsing with that single heartbeat. The sound carried across the open ground to the walls, and every defender who heard it knew what it meant. The waiting was over. The defenders roused themselves, men who had been dozing sitting up, shaking off sleep, gripping their weapons, moving to their positions along the walls. There was no panic, no rush, just the tired movements of men who had done this before and would do it again until they could not do it anymore. Torches were lit along the ramparts, pools of light in the darkness, and in that flickering glow, you could see faces set with determination and exhaustion and something beyond both, a kind of emptiness that comes when fear has burned away and all that remains is the task at hand. The Ottoman forces moved forward in the darkness, thousands of men advancing across the ground between their camps and the walls, and they came not in silence but with shouts and battle cries, voices raised to drive away their own fear, to make themselves feel larger and stronger than they were. The Bashi bazooks reached the outer wall first, and the assault began with arrows flying up from below and down from above, with men climbing ladders that were pushed away and fell, with stones thrown and swords swung and the chaos of close combat in the darkness where you could barely see who you were fighting. The defenders held. They had practice now, weeks of practice, and they knew how to fight from the walls, how to use the height advantage, how to make every arrow count. The Ottoman irregulars fell back, regrouped, attacked again, and the pattern repeated, wave after wave breaking against the walls like the sea itself, and the defenders held because they had to, because there was nowhere to retreat to, because this was the last wall and behind it was everything they were fighting for. As the first gray light of dawn began to seep into the eastern sky, the Anatolian troops advanced, and the assault intensified. These were better soldiers, disciplined and determined, and they concentrated their attack on the weakest points, especially the breach near the St. Romanus Gate where Giustiniani commanded. The fighting there became desperate, hand-to-hand combat on top of the makeshift barrier that filled the gap in the wall, men pushing and cutting and dying in a space so crowded that the dead could not fall but stood pressed between the living. And then, in the midst of the battle, something happened that would change everything. Giovanni Giustiniani was struck by an arrow or a bullet, accounts differ, but the wound was serious, and he could not continue fighting. His men carried him away from the breach, down from the walls, and word spread quickly through the defenders that their best commander was down. In battles, momentum is everything, and the loss of a leader can break the spirit of men who were holding on by sheer will. Some of the Genoa soldiers, seeing their commander wounded, began to fall back, opening gaps in the defense that had been solid moments before. At almost the same time, a small group of Ottoman soldiers found one of the small gates, the Kirko Porta, left unlocked by accident or fate. They pushed through, climbing up to the ramparts from inside, and suddenly the defenders were fighting enemies in front and behind. Panic began to spread, the kind of panic that is like fire, starting small but growing fast, and men who had held their positions for hours began to break and run because when the line wavers, Every soldier has to decide whether to stand alone or retreat with the others, and most choose to live. The Janissaries, seeing the defense falter, poured through the breach and over the walls, and now there were too many of them, too many for the exhausted defenders to hold back, and the walls that had stood for 1,000 years were finally breached beyond repair. Constantine, the emperor, was last seen fighting on the walls near the breach, surrounded by enemy soldiers, and he fell there, though his body was never identified with certainty. He died as he had lived in those final weeks, as a soldier defending his city, and with him died the Roman Empire, the last thread connecting back to Caesar and Augustus and all the centuries of history that had led to this dawn. The Ottoman soldiers flooded into the city, and what followed was what always followed when cities fell after long sieges. The promise of 3 days of plunder was kept, and the soldiers spread through the streets, breaking into houses, taking what they could carry, and the people who could not flee were caught up in the violence that conquest brings. It was not unique to this battle or this army. It was the way of war in that age, perhaps in every age, the reward for those who survived the assault, the price paid by those who lost. But amid the chaos and the horror, there were also moments of restraint and mercy. Murad had ordered that important buildings should be protected, that certain lives should be spared, and some of his commanders followed those orders. The great churches were converted to mosques, but they were not destroyed. Many of the scholars and artists were captured but not killed, because Murad wanted to make Constantinople into his capital, and he would need people who knew how to run a city, how to keep the knowledge of centuries alive. The city that had been Constantinople became Istanbul, though the change happened gradually over years rather than in a single moment. The walls still stood, damaged but not demolished, and they stand even now, silent witnesses to that spring morning when one age ended and another began. The people who survived adapted and carried on because that is what people do. They find ways to live in whatever world they wake up to. For those 3 days after the fall, the city belonged to the conquerors, and the streets that had been quiet that last night were filled with noise and movement and the terrible energy of victory and defeat mixed together. And then the 3 days ended, and order was restored, and the work began of transforming what had been into what would be. Mehmed visited Hagia Sophia, that great church that had been the heart of Orthodox Christianity for 900 years, and he ordered it converted to a mosque, and the dome that had held the prayers of Christians now held the prayers of Muslims. The same prayers really, if you listen to what they asked for, mercy and guidance and protection, the things that all people pray for regardless of the name they call God. The libraries were searched and scrolls and books were taken, some destroyed, some preserved, the lottery of survival that written words face in times of upheaval. Knowledge was lost and knowledge was saved, and centuries later, scholars would still argue about what was kept and what vanished into smoke and time. The treasures of the city, the gold and silver and jewels accumulated over 1,000 years, were divided among the victors, and some of it was melted down and some found its way to mosques and palaces across the Ottoman Empire, and some disappeared entirely, hidden or lost or carried away to places unknown. The families that survived faced choices about whether to stay or leave, and many left, fleeing to Italy or other parts of Europe, taking with them their memories and their skills and their books, and some historians believe this diaspora of scholars helped spark the Renaissance, that the fall of Constantinople was one of the threads that wove together to create the rebirth of learning in the West. But that is history looking backward, finding patterns and connections. In the moment, for those who fled, it was just survival, just taking what you could carry and hoping for safety somewhere else. For Murad, the conquest made him Murad the conqueror, Feda Sultan Murad, and he ruled for 30 more years from his new capital. He brought in people from across his empire to repopulate the city, Muslims and Christians and Jews, making it diverse again, a cosmopolitan center of trade and culture, different from what it had been but still a bridge between worlds. The walls were repaired in places and left damaged in others, no longer needed for defense as much as before now that the city was the heart of an empire rather than its edge. And through all the changes, the sea kept breathing against the walls, the water dark and ancient, and the sun kept rising over the Bosporus, light spreading across the water the way it always had, and the city kept living in its new form, neither better nor worse than what it had been, just different, just changed, because everything changes and nothing lasts except the land and the water and the sky that holds them all. But on that last night, before the drums and the assault and the fall, the city still stood as it had stood for 1,000 years, and the walls still rose into the darkness, and the people still slept behind those walls, dreaming whatever dreams come to people who know they are living at the edge of history but cannot know exactly when it will tip. That night held all the nights that had come before it and none of the mornings that would come after. It was its own moment, complete and separate, the last breath before the plunge, and if we could step into it now, if we could walk those ramparts in the cool spring darkness, we would find a kind of peace there, the peace that comes when the waiting is almost over, when the question is about to be answered, and there is nothing left to do but rest. The sentries on the walls would nod to us as we passed, tired men who welcomed any distraction from their thoughts, and we could look out with them at the sea of fires spread across the hills, thousands of points of light marking where the Ottoman army rested before the storm. And if we listened very carefully, we might hear the sound that the walls themselves made, not a sound exactly but a presence, a weight of time and history pressed into stone, the accumulation of all the hands that had touched them, all the eyes that had looked out from them, all the feet that had walked along their tops, layer upon layer of human presence absorbed into the rock until the walls were as much memory as matter. Behind us, the city would be mostly dark, just a few lights here and there, a candle in a window, a torch at a street corner, enough to mark the pathways but not enough to dispel the shadows that filled the empty spaces. The great dome of Hagia Sophia would rise above the rooftops, a shape darker than the sky, blocking out stars, and we could imagine the candles burning inside, the icons gleaming in the flickering light, the prayers being whispered by priests who had not stopped praying since the siege began, because prayer was all they had left to offer. If we walked down from the walls into the streets, our footsteps would echo in the emptiness, and we might pass a few other figures moving through the darkness, people who could not sleep, who needed to walk and move and feel that they were still alive, still free to move through their city even if it might be for the last time. We would not speak to them, and they would not speak to us, because some things are too large for words, and on that night, everyone carried their own private weight of what they knew was coming. We could walk to the harbor and stand at the water's edge, looking out at the ships anchored there, the few remaining vessels of a fleet that had once dominated these waters, and we could see the reflections of starlight on the small waves, broken pieces of light dancing on the surface. The chain still stretched across the entrance to the Golden Horn, and we could follow it with our eyes from one shore to the other, that massive barrier that had protected the harbor for so long and now stood bypassed and almost irrelevant, because the Ottoman ships had been carried over the land and launched behind it, a demonstration that no defense is final, that human ingenuity will always find a way around or through or over whatever stands in its path. But for now, in this moment, the harbor is quiet, the water lapping gently at the stone quays, and if we close our eyes, we can pretend that nothing has changed, that the city is safe, that tomorrow will be like yesterday and all the days before, merchants arriving with goods from distant lands, fishermen bringing in their catch, children running along the waterfront, life continuing in its ordinary patterns. We can pretend, but the pretense lasts only as long as we keep our eyes closed, because when we open them, the reality is still there, the fires on the hills, the damaged walls, the exhaustion on every face. If we had time, we could visit the palace, though most of it stands empty now. The emperors who once filled its halls with courtiers and ceremonies long since reduced to this. Constantine and his small circle of advisors and soldiers, making do in a few rooms of a complex built for a glory that has faded. The throne room is dark, the throne itself just a chair now, stripped of the mystical authority it once held when the empire stretched across half the known world. Constantine does not sit on it tonight. He is on the walls with his men, or making his rounds through the city, or catching a few hours of sleep in his armor because there is no time or reason to remove it. We could sit in that empty throne room and think about all the men who sat on that throne before Constantine, who founded the city and gave it his name, Justinian, who built Hagia Sophia and reconquered half the lost territories of Rome, Basil the Bulgar slayer who expanded the empire to its greatest medieval extent, and all the others, names that stretch back through the centuries, each one believing in some way that their empire would last forever because empires always believe that, even when the evidence suggests otherwise. And now it comes down to this, an empty throne room in a besieged city, waiting for a dawn that will end the line. But we should not be sad, not exactly, because sadness suggests that something wrong has happened, and this is just what happens to empires and cities and all the works of human hands. Everything built eventually falls. Every name eventually fades. Constantinople lasted longer than most, 1,000 years from the refounding as a Christian capital to this final night, and that is more than most cities ever achieve. The stones will remain, the location will remain, the Bosporus will continue to flow between Europe and Asia carrying ships and trade and the endless movement of human ambition, and new buildings will rise on the foundations of the old, and new people will call this place home, and the story will continue in a different form. That is the nature of things, the way the world breathes, in and out, building up and breaking down, and we are all part of that pattern, whether we are emperors or soldiers or ordinary people just trying to live our lives. The siege of Constantinople was not an aberration but a chapter in a larger story, the story of how human societies change and adapt and replace each other, sometimes violently, sometimes peacefully, but always inevitably, because nothing stays the same no matter how much we might wish it to. As the night deepens toward morning, as the hours count down to the moment when the drums will begin, let us find a quiet spot on the walls, a place where we can sit with our backs against the ancient stone and look up at the stars. They are the same stars that shone on the city when it was founded, the same stars that will shine on whatever comes after, and they remind us that in the vast scope of the universe, our struggles are very small, our triumphs temporary, our losses not as final as they seem. The stone is cool against our backs, and it feels solid, dependable, like something that cannot be moved. But we know it can be moved. We know it will be moved. The cannons have proven that. The great stones flying through the air and smashing into walls that had stood inviolate for centuries, teaching the lesson that nothing made by humans is permanent, that every defense can be breached given enough time and determination and the willingness to pay the cost in lives and effort. But for now, in this quiet hour, the stone still stands, and we can rest against it and feel its strength even while knowing its limitations. That is enough. To be here, to witness this moment, to breathe the cool night air and feel the ancient pulse of the city around us, this is enough. We do not need to see the end. We do not need to carry the weight of what will happen in a few hours. We can simply be here, now, in this pause between the past and the future, this small pocket of time that belongs to neither conquest nor defeat but only to the quiet reality of existence. The wind picks up slightly, coming off the sea, and it carries salt and the smell of the deep water, and it moves through the empty streets behind us, rattling a loose shutter somewhere, stirring the leaves of the trees that still grow in gardens and courtyards, trees that do not care about empires, that drop their leaves and grow new ones according to their own rhythms, year after year, regardless of who claims to rule the land they grow in. Let your breathing slow to match the rhythm of that wind, in and out, steady and calm, and feel the tension leaving your body, your shoulders dropping, your jaw unclenching, your hands relaxing their grip on whatever they were holding. There is nothing to hold on to anyway. We cannot stop what is coming. We cannot change the past or control the future. We can only be here, in this moment, breathing and alive and aware of the deep current of time that flows through everything, connecting us to all the people who lived before and all who will live after. The stone beneath us is patient. It has waited for centuries. It can wait a few hours more. And we can wait with it, not in anxiety or dread, but in acceptance, in the knowledge that this too shall pass, that the morning will come and then the afternoon and then another night, and the world will still be here, changed but not ended, different but not destroyed, because life continues, always, finding new forms, new pathways, new ways to express itself even in the ruins of what came before. Think about water, how it flows around obstacles, how it finds every crack and crevice, how it can be gentle as dew or fierce as a storm but always follows its nature, moving from high to low, from mountain to sea, patient and persistent and absolutely certain in its path. The walls can stop an army, but they cannot stop water. Time is like that, flowing around and through and over everything, and we are carried in that current whether we struggle against it or let ourselves float. Let yourself float now. Feel the stone beneath you becoming softer, or perhaps you are becoming lighter, and the distinction does not matter because you are safe here, held in this moment, suspended between the earth